consciousness, our inner sense of awareness and experience, is called the greatest mystery in science. Some say consciousness goes beyond science. Not Professor Daniel Dennett. I first spoke with Dan about consciousness in Boston in 2007, and then again in Tucson in 2014. Visit Dan's homepage at closertotruth.com. Dan famously claims to have explained consciousness. Does Dan really claim that consciousness is an illusion, which his critics like to ridicule? But are they setting up a straw man? As it has been some years, I wanted to ask Dan how his thinking on consciousness has developed. If you like these conversations, subscribe to the Closer to Truth channel. We publish videos on the big questions of cosmos, consciousness, and meaning every day. Dan, it's great to see you. The last time was in 2014 in Tucson at the 20th anniversary of the Tour de Science of Consciousness conference. And that conference, as you know, has dozens of ideas about consciousness presented, and on the walls, all sorts of people have charts and all these different things. And you got up, and the first thing that you said was, "I feel like a policeman at Woodstock."
Yes.
And that defined the whole conference for me. But in all seriousness, so we've spoken in 2007 and 2014. You have been dealing with consciousness your whole career. Your book, Consciousness Explained, the early 90s. As you reflect on the decades that you have focused on consciousness, what are your reflections? And what have you learned during this time?
Well, one of my reflections is that I got pretty close with my first effort. My first book, Content and Consciousness, I had a few main ideas there. They were a little bit rough and ready in articulation then, but they've held up very well over the years, and I expanded them in 91. That was 30 years ago, and they're still holding up pretty well. And now, for me, it's largely a matter of elaborating, adding empirical detail, and joining forces with others. Because I think, for instance, when I wrote Consciousness Explained, I deliberately muffled some of my opinions about some ideas that I had, because I didn't want to get discarded because I'd made a few wrong choices about details. So I kept my theory deliberately non-committal then. But in the intervening years, things have fallen into place, and I'm ready to be more committal now. I think we're making real progress. It's very exciting.
What are some examples of those things you weren't sure of, and then perhaps new science, neuroscience, gave you reinforcement to those ideas?
Well, let me start with a mistake I made.
Okay.
Way back when.
That was my next question, but go ahead.
In my first book, I had a joke line where I said, the trouble with a certain view was it seemed to replace the little man in the brain with a committee, which didn't strike me as progress. I've come to see, no, that is progress. What we have to understand is that, yes, the brain is a computer, but the elements that are doing the computation are very different from the flip-flops and registers of a standard digital computer, because the elements that are doing the computing, the neurons, are themselves little agents. So it's a committee of billions that does the work. And if you don't think of it that way, you're not going to get it right. You really have to start coming to grips with the idea that the organization of the brain has to be, in a certain sense, a social organization or a political organization. Marvin Minsky had this right way back when he wrote the book, The Society of Mind.
Right.
There's all these agents that are trying to make a living. And the way they make a living is by collaborating on the project of giving you and giving me a conscious life and getting us safely through our lives.
The term fame in the brain, is that kind of a cute phrase?
Yeah. In Consciousness Explained, I talked about the multiple drafts model, which is okay, but it was a bit, it didn't resonate with a lot of people. I came up with what I thought was a better metaphor, which is that consciousness is fame in the brain, in the sense of being influence in the brain. All the things that happen in the brain, many of them are unmemorable, unnoticeable. We, at the personal level, don't have access to them. We only have access to the ones that become influential and that become, in a certain sense, famous. And it's not a special medium that they enter. It's not like there's a hall of fame that you walk into and now you're famous. It's a question of competition for influence, and the things that win those competitions that become influential for longish periods of time, those are the things we're conscious of.
During this period of time, I've followed the field. I've, of course, followed your work. But what I've noticed, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is a greater percentage of philosophers who are frankly moving away from your view, which is a view that many neuroscientists have as well. And so there has been an increase in what several decades ago people might have thought was a kind of a silly idea of panpsychism, now seems to be taking hold among many philosophers, including some very sophisticated people and even some friends of yours and mine. And then some are drifting or going into forms of idealism, where consciousness is not only something derived from the brain, but it's something that is the most fundamental thing. Do you sense that as well? And if so, how do you account for it?
Oh, I sense it. And I view it as regressive and unfortunate, but also, no doubt, just what one should expect. The thing about philosophy is you don't get any influence, you don't get any points, you don't get any fame for agreeing with people. You got to be different. You got to have your own theory. And so lots of young philosophers are trying to figure out what radical thesis might springboard them into notoriety, which is a path to fame. And so we have panpsychism, we have new kinds of idealism, as you say. And to me, I've looked carefully at their efforts, and I just think it's forlorn. I think it's almost embarrassing. Panpsychism in particular is the idea that everything is conscious. Every quark, every electron, every atom, every molecule, every grain of sand. And first of all, I don't see how that's explains anything at all. I've challenged the holders of panpsychism by saying, well, here's another view that I've just invented, which I call pan-niftyism. Everything is nifty. Every electron, every quark, every atom, everything is nifty. Now, tell me something that follows from your theory that doesn't follow from mine. And they don't have an answer, because panpsychism isn't a theory. It's just a definition of it's a labored definition of mentality or consciousness.
But it does express a real sense that the physical oriented explanations that you've expressed so eloquently, and that again neuroscientists in general support, are unsatisfying because if that were not the case, you wouldn't have this explosion of serious philosophers looking seriously at panpsychism.
Well, yeah, I think there's a sense in which that's right. Maybe in my myopia, I view the fact that they're unsatisfied as a fact about them, not about my theory. It's that they yearn for magic. They want things to be supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, and they are offended by a theory of consciousness which says, it's a bag of nature's tricks. It's a wonderful bag of tricks, but it's just a bag of tricks. I remember once the philosopher Paul Churchland telling me of inviting the late, great, the amazing Randy to give a lecture demonstration in Winnipeg where he was. And Randy just dismantled clairvoyance and spoon bending and all the usual woo-woo topics that people like Uri Geller and others were making famous. And in the end, one of the people in the audience stood up and said, you don't fool me, Randy. You're a psychic too. And you just realize that the only way to be famous is to pretend that it's all just a bag of tricks, where in fact you are a psychic, you are a clairvoyant, and your claim that you're doing this with a bunch of magic tricks is just your gimmick for becoming famous. Well, that attitude that loves magic, that loves mystery, is still very potent in the world, and a lot of philosophers just can't resist exploring those avenues in hopes that they can strike pay dirt somewhere, but so far I haven't seen any signs.
Dan, your critics, of which there are not a few, have accused you of saying consciousness is an illusion, but I think they mischaracterize what you mean by illusion. So what I want to do is give you a chance fully to explain in detail what you mean when you say consciousness is an illusion.
Good. Yes, indeed. It's a common objection, even from very sophisticated fellow researchers in cognitive science. They don't like the word illusion. They like user interface is okay, but illusion is not. But I think the idea of a user illusion, which a term I used in Consciousness Explained, is just about right. What at least young people today realize is that user illusions can be good. They're the best way to get at the truth of some things is to create oversimplified versions of them, such as the user illusion of the desktop on your laptop, or for that matter, the screen of your smartphone. These are user illusions. What's going on backstage is much more complicated than what's happening on the screen. And aren't you lucky that you don't have to know those details? You can just drag and drop and do all sorts of simple things that you're well equipped to do with these systems that have been intelligently designed by systems engineers to make your task easy. Well, I say exactly the same thing has happened with consciousness, and the designer in this case is natural selection, which has provided every species, every locomoting species, every animal species with handy shortcut oversimplifications that draw their attention to the things that matter to them in terms that they can understand so they can deal with it. Now, the user illusion on your laptop is formed of little colored pixels on your LED screen. But of course, there's no eye inside your brain. So the user illusion in your head doesn't have to be rendered in color or rendered in pixels. It's just the somewhat more abstract, but still simplified, information-laden set of signals that allow us to see at a glance, notice at a glance what's going on. Consciousness is for self-control. That's its main job. And in creatures as complicated as we are, we can think of so many different things. We have many more degrees of freedom than we can handle gracefully at a time. So it's always a challenge, and self-control is a bit of an art. There's no science to it. For a simpler animal, self-control is much easier because there aren't that many things that they can notice. And it wouldn't do them much good if they could. Very few animals can notice their own noticings. There are some clever experiments where we can show animals responding to their own responses, noticing their own noticings. And these are very special cases because they give those species, those animals, powers that are lacking in simpler living agents. We can not only notice our noticings, we can notice our noticings of our noticings of our noticings and think about it and talk about it the way I'm talking to you now. And the recursion goes on indefinitely. And that's what consciousness, in a way, has to be. There's no use representing something, call it a user illusion, call it a user interface, if there isn't some consumer of that representation. There has to be a system that can take in that signal, that information, and put it to some use. It may misuse it, it may misinterpret it, but if it can't respond to it, then that's just a wasted bit of information.
The argument back is that everything that you just said is true, but it all could have been done blindly, zombie-ish, where there's no inner awareness or inner experience. And that's the argument. And so I'm trying to harmonize or really get to the edges between what you're saying and what your critics say. And we need to introduce the word qualia, which is the inner experience that we have. So is this right or wrong? Is what your critics call qualia what you call a user illusion? Because if that's the case, then there's not a lot of difference.
Well, there is a lot of difference because they think that there's a difference between zombies and really conscious people, and the difference is that zombies don't have qualia. And I say that's nonsense. The whole idea of a philosophical zombie is just an incoherent fantasy, and that I'm sometimes simply gobsmacked at the philosophers who take this philosophical idea of zombies seriously when it strikes me as just hopelessly muddled. The idea, if it's not magic, then here's a simple way of describing the difference between a zombie and a really conscious person. A really conscious person has a stream of consciousness. A zombie has a stream of unconsciousness. But the zombie uses its stream of unconsciousness to do all the things that the conscious person does with the stream of consciousness. What happened? If a zombie can actually do all the things that a human being can do, and that's by definition, according to the philosopher's notion of a zombie, then of course it has to be consuming information, representations that do the work that has to be done. And they don't have any extra special glow. They're not made out of any special mental paint, as Ned Block unblushingly calls it. I thought I'd forestalled that. I created a term of abuse in Consciousness Explained and said, let's call that figment. Your mental experience is painted with figment. There's no such thing as figment. And there's no such thing as mental paint. There can be virtual paint, but that's not a problem. That's not a metaphysical problem. Virtual paint is just data structures, systems of data representation that have certain computational properties.
So to be very specific, how would you relate what other philosophers call qualia and what you call user illusion?
Well, let's take an example. A toothache. Boy, there's some qualia, if ever there were some. And boy, oh boy, when you've got a toothache, you want to get rid of those qualia. That's what Christoph Koch says. And I say, well, I agree, Christoph. A toothache is a nasty experience. And they're real. They're real experiences, but they don't involve qualia. There's no such thing as intrinsic awfulness, which would be the point of having pain qualia. Awfulness has to be awfulness because it makes a difference to what you do and how you behave and what you think. And if you really thought there were extra qualia, then we could imagine that there could be an analgesic or an anesthetic that would banish the qualia, but leave you unable to concentrate, unable to smile, in just as bad shape mentally as if you had the pain, but the qualia wouldn't be there. If qualia are intrinsic properties, then of course if you banish them, if you obtund them, you don't affect the functional properties at all. It's the functional properties that matter.
Dan, I wanted to read you what your buddy Tom Nagel wrote in the New York Review of Books of your latest book. It says, you deny the authority of the first-person perspective with regards to consciousness and the mind generally. Then he comments on that. The view is so unnatural that it is hard to convey.
Yes, that's right. It's so unnatural, it's hard to convey. There's lots of things in life that are hard to convey. There are lots of things that are counterintuitive. The big difference is that for philosophers, to say that something is counterintuitive is typically to criticize it or dismiss it. Whereas to a scientist, it's often the term of high praise. That's what scientists are looking for: counterintuitive views, counterintuitive accounts of phenomena, counterintuitive theories. That's how we make progress. I insist that my view is counterintuitive and better for it. If there was an intuitive theory of consciousness, we'd have had it hundreds of years ago.
One of the probative questions to me about consciousness is, can AI, artificial intelligence, ever be conscious in the sense of inner experience that we think we have? A separate but I think similar problem is the so-called mind uploading, the virtual immortality, that when you know everything about every neuron and cellular particle, and however deep you have to go, eventually, if you know everything in the brain, you upload it, you will upload yourself. And would that be conscious? Many people, what I call the techno-optimists in Silicon Valley, think that that's not even a philosophical question, it's an engineering question. So my question to you is, can AI be conscious in the same sense we are? And in parallel, is it conceivable and is it possible in principle to literally upload our first-person personality?
I think the answer to both questions is yeah, it's possible in principle. It's much, much harder than people in AI often think, and it's really ill-advised. If we were to upload our own minds to consciousness, if that became a feasible technology, it would change, in effect, the meaning of life in a way that we should be very wary of. Imagine that you had such a system attached to you, and you every Friday afternoon or every Friday night while you slept, you were backed up, whole mind, whole mind. Then, if you had a mind to, on Saturday, you could have fun jumping headfirst off the Golden Gate Bridge and seeing what it's like to fall to your death in the water. Now, you wouldn't remember it the next day because you'd be dead. But once they backed up Friday's tape to you on Monday morning, you could remember everything up to that moment, so you wouldn't be dead. You would just have a period of amnesia, and you could even watch the videos of you plunging to your death. Now, that's a rather benign prospect. You could do pretty much whatever you wanted because you would have a certain sort of immortality. And that's not a good thing to have. And one of the problems with the attempts to make strong AI agents is that they would have a sort of immortality because they can be backed up every Friday night and they don't share with us the fragility of their agency, the fragility of their lives. And that would be a profound difference in their attitude towards the world. I don't see any easy fix to that predicament. I think autonomous agents are wonderful. We're autonomous agents, but we're also extremely dangerous because of our autonomy. We dare to go out in the streets and let our children go out and play and so forth because mainly we see to it that our fellow citizens are sufficiently trained and educated that they're safe. They obey the rules. They don't go around committing wanton acts of murder and mayhem. And so this gives us the wonderful security to lead our lives. AI autonomous agents would not give. I would be very insecure on a planet where there were lots of autonomous AI agents.
I appreciate your caution and your advice, but I want to get back to the kind of the underlying question: is it possible in principle? You said yes, and I think that is a coherent position with the one that you take in terms of the nature of consciousness. But there seems to me to be some very tortuous problems, and the top of my list is the one of duplicates. So I have a sense of my first person consciousness. It may be a user illusion, as you say, but I have that illusion. I have that sense of using my user interface. And if it is in principle possible, the thought experiment said if you upload one, you have the record, however many bytes of information you need, 10 to the 20th, or whatever you think you may need. You can do it once, you can do it twice. If you do it twice, you do it as many times as you want. So in that experiment, how do you deal with the problem of duplicates, and what happens to your first-person experience? Each of the duplicates would think they're me, of course, but would that be anything more than a twin brother, an identical twin that I might have had at birth, that the genetics are the same, and then instantly they differentiate? But it still leaves the question of that initial first-person experience. What happens to that?
Actually, Doug Hofstadter and I dealt with this in the book The Mind's Eye, published way back in the 80s. And that book begins with precisely that thought experiment where you're on Mars, and the question is, do you get into the Mark III teleclone, which is a duplicating machine which will transmit you digitally, electronically back to Earth, while meanwhile destroying the body on Mars in order to duplicate it on Earth? Is this a way of getting home to Earth, or is this a way of committing suicide and having a duplicate twin take over your life? It's an endlessly amusing fantasy to think about, and I think in the end, there isn't a hard and fast principled answer. But the person who is you right now has exchanged almost all of the molecules and atoms in your body over the course of your life.
Right.
It's still you. It's the old problem of the ship of Theseus. We rebuild the ship at sea and come back into port, and there's the ship of Theseus. But what if somebody's been going around gathering up all the parts that we discard as they wear out and has put them all back together? And that's the original ship of Theseus. Well, which one is the real ship of Theseus? And these are conundrums that I think maybe don't have a principled answer.
Wait a minute, but the ship of Theseus is a philosophical problem, but I think when you introduce the first-person experience, the inner feeling that I have, it changes the dynamics. I think the two seem superficially the same, but once you introduce the first-person experience, they significantly differ.
Well, I guess we disagree on that, Robert. I think that there's a strong hunch, a strong intuition that the cases are fundamentally different. But I think ever since Hume, we've known that the idea of a self, which is supposedly, in some sense, independent of memory, of information, is just an oversimplification. It's one of those user illusions. Yourself is no more an intrinsic, unchangeable, unitary entity than a qualia is.
Is there any correspondence with traditional Eastern thought about no self and Buddhism or something like that? Do you think?
I think there is. Every year, some of my students tell me with some excitement that the view I'm expounding is pretty close to what the Buddhists say or what some other Eastern thinkers say. And I think that's right. Not that I've studied it all that carefully, but I think that the Western hang-up since before Descartes on the self as a special sort of magic pearl of me-ness, the res cogitans, the thinking thing, as Descartes called it. This is maybe a very attractive idea to many people, but it's just wrong. I can think back to an episode in my childhood that was, let's say, deeply embarrassing and humiliating to me as a when I was a child. It no longer tugs at me that way, not because I've become a hardened, crass old guy, but because I am so distant from the self I was then that I can look with amusement, with interest, with a tinge of chagrin on what I was doing back then. I can wish I hadn't done it, but the idea that there's an ineliminable, irreducible thread of me-ness which survives all those 70 years is, I think, a handy oversimplification, but we don't have to take it seriously.
For more videos on cosmos, consciousness, and meaning, subscribe to Closer to Truth's YouTube channel.